The sound of metal scraping concrete echoed through Willowbrook Estates as I dragged the final "Condemned" sign across what used to be Brenda Wellington's perfectly manicured driveway. The October morning air was crisp, with the kind of suburban silence that comes right before everything falls apart. Brenda stood frozen in her doorway, clutching her laminated HOA rulebook like a shield against reality, watching 12 months of her tyrannical reign crumble in real time. Her perfectly coordinated beige outfit, the same shade as every approved exterior paint color in our CC&Rs, seemed to blend into the doorframe behind her. For once in her life, Brenda Wellington had nothing to say. No violations to cite, no fines to levy, no neighbors to intimidate. Just the sweet, devastating sound of consequences finally coming home to roost. But you didn't come here to see the ending, did you? You came to understand how we got here. How one woman's obsession with a door color became the catalyst for the most methodical, legally bulletproof neighborhood takeover in HOA history. Let me take you back to where this all started. 18 months earlier, on a Saturday morning that should have been perfectly ordinary in our cookie-cutter suburb of Willowbrook Estates, Minnesota, the kind of morning where the biggest decision should have been whether to use the electric or the manual hedge trimmer. Instead, it became the day I learned that painting your own front door the wrong shade of red could trigger a suburban Cold War that would reshape an entire neighborhood. I remember standing on my front porch that morning, coffee mug in one hand, paintbrush in the other, admiring the rich, warm finish I'd just applied to my 1940s Colonial's front door. Heritage Red, Benjamin Moore's HC 181 to be precise. It was gorgeous, dignified. Kind of color that made you feel like you lived in a home, not just a house. The morning sun caught the semi-gloss finish perfectly, and for about 3 blissful hours I thought I'd made the best home improvement decision of my life. Then the mail arrived. You have to understand something about Willowbrook Estates. On paper, it's the kind of neighborhood that sells itself. Tree-lined streets, sidewalks that actually connect to somewhere useful, houses built when quality mattered more than quantity. The HOA website, and yes, they had a website, complete with a newsletter archive going back to 2003, promised maintained property values through reasonable community standards. Reasonable. That word should have been my first red flag. The manila envelope felt heavier than it should have. Inside was a single sheet of HOA letterhead, official enough to make your stomach drop, casual enough to feel like a slap in the face. Notice of covenant violation was printed in bold across the top, followed by my name, address, and a violation code that might as well have been written in ancient Greek for all the sense it made to me at the time. Dear Homeowner, it began. Not Dear Mr. Davidson, because personalizing intimidation letters might have required actual human effort. It has come to the attention of the Architectural Review Committee that unauthorized exterior modifications have been made to your property without proper approval. Specifically, the door of your residence has been painted in a color that does not comply with Section 4.2.7 of the Community Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. 4.2.7. I had to read that 3 times before the audacity sank in. They had an entire subsection dedicated to door colors. An entire subsection. We're talking about a piece of wood, a functional piece of wood that keeps the weather out of my house and the burglars out of my living room. But apparently, in Willowbrook Estates, that piece of wood was also a threat to the very fabric of suburban civilization. The letter continued with the kind of bureaucratic poetry that only a truly committed petty tyrant could compose. The selected color exceeds the acceptable parameters outlined in the approved color palette and creates visual discord within the established aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. Visual discord. I had created visual discord by painting my door a color that existed naturally on about half the maple trees lining our street every October. But the real masterpiece was the signature at the bottom. Brenda Wellington, President, Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. The signature was perfect. Looping, confident, the kind of penmanship that suggested someone had practiced signing official documents in front of a mirror. Below her name was a phone number, an email address, and office hours. Office hours? This woman held office hours for HOA business. That afternoon, I did what any reasonable person would do. I called the number. Willowbrook Estates, this is Brenda. Her voice was exactly what you would expect from someone who signs violation notices with that much flourish. Crisp, professional, with an undertone that suggested she was doing you a tremendous favor by answering the phone. Hi, this is Jake Davidson. I got a letter today about my front door. Oh yes, Mr. Davidson. Thank you for calling so promptly. We do appreciate homeowners who take these matters seriously. There was a pause, the sound of papers shuffling. Now, the violation is quite straightforward. Your door color is not pre-approved, which means it's in direct violation of our community standards. The good news is that this is easily remedied. Easily remedied. As if I was supposed to be grateful for the privilege of repainting my door to match her personal preferences. I'm sorry, I said, trying to keep my voice level, still believing this could be resolved with logic and common sense. But can you help me understand what exactly is wrong with the color? It's heritage red. It's a classic colonial color that actually matches the architectural style of the house. Another pause. This one longer, more pointed. Mr. Davidson, I understand that you may not be familiar with our community guidelines, but the Architectural Review Committee has very carefully curated our approved color palette to maintain property values and community cohesion. Heritage red is not on that list. Okay, I said, still playing reasonable neighbor, still believing this could be resolved with logic and common sense. Could you send me a copy of this approved color palette? I'd be happy to take a look. Of course. I'll have that in the mail to you today, along with the relevant sections of our CC&Rs that outline the approval process for exterior modifications. I think you'll find that our system works quite well when everyone follows the proper procedures. The proper procedures. Those 3 words should have told me everything I needed to know about Brenda Wellington and the little kingdom she'd built in our subdivision. But at the time, I was still operating under the naive assumption that homeowners associations were run by reasonable people who wanted to help their neighbors maintain nice properties. The packet arrived 2 days later. Not one sheet of paper this time, but a full manila folder stuffed with documentation that would have made the IRS proud. The approved color palette was a single page buried in the middle. 12 colors, all various shades of beige, cream, and what could generously be called light tan. It looked like someone had spilled coffee on white paper and called it a design philosophy. But the real education was in the CC&Rs. 47 pages of single-spaced legal text that governed everything from the height of mailbox posts to the acceptable brands of roof shingles. Section 4.2.7 was indeed dedicated to door colors, but it was just the beginning. There were sections on window treatments visible from the street, regulations about holiday decorations, and a fascinating subsection about unauthorized plant materials that apparently included any flower that hadn't been specifically approved by the landscaping committee. And there, buried in Section 12.3.4, was the enforcement mechanism that would eventually become Brenda's downfall. Violations that remain uncorrected after the initial 30-day notice period shall incur daily fines of $50 until compliance is achieved. $50 a day for a door color. That's when I realized I wasn't dealing with a reasonable person who happened to care a lot about neighborhood aesthetics. I was dealing with someone who had weaponized bureaucracy, someone who had turned a homeowners association into a personal fiefdom where she could exercise the kind of control that most people only dream about. Someone who was about to discover that threatening a real estate attorney with property liens was like challenging a chess master to a game of checkers. The war had begun. Brenda, just didn't know she'd already lost.
Mr. Davidson, I'm afraid you've left us no choice but to schedule an emergency board meeting to address your continued noncompliance. The crisp authority in Brenda Wellington's voice crackled through my phone speaker like static electricity before a thunderstorm. Emergency board meeting. Over a door color? This was the moment I realized I wasn't dealing with your garden variety neighborhood busybody. I was dealing with someone who had turned suburban governance into performance art. But Brenda had made one crucial miscalculation. She thought she was intimidating a regular homeowner who would cave under pressure. Instead, she was about to get a masterclass in what happens when you threaten someone who reads legal documents for fun and has 15 years of experience dismantling bureaucratic power structures for a living. You're about to witness the moment when suburban tyranny met its match, and trust me, it was more entertaining than anything Netflix had to offer that year. 2 weeks had passed since that first violation notice landed on my doorstep like a declaration of war wrapped in legal letterhead. 2 weeks during which I'd learned more about the inner workings of Willowbrook Estates than most residents discovered in decades of living here. And what I'd learned wasn't pretty. See, the thing about HOA presidents is that they're usually one of two types: the reluctant volunteer who got stuck with the job because nobody else wanted it, or the power-hungry micro-dictator who sees the position as their chance to finally matter in the world. Brenda Wellington was definitely the latter. With a twist that made her particularly dangerous, she was competent, ruthlessly, terrifyingly competent. I'd started my research the morning after that phone call, beginning with the most basic question any lawyer asks when facing an opponent: who exactly am I dealing with? The Hennepin County property records told me that Brenda had owned her house at 1247 Maple Lane for 8 years, having purchased it for $340,000 in 2015. The mortgage was paid off, always a sign of someone with either exceptional financial discipline or family money. Her LinkedIn profile, which took some creative searching to find, revealed a 20-year career in corporate compliance for a medical device company with a specialty in regulatory frameworks and process optimization. Process optimization. That explained everything. But the real education came from diving into the HOA meeting minutes, which were meticulously archived on the community website going back to Brenda's election as president 3 years earlier. Reading those minutes was like watching someone systematically dismantle a functioning democracy and rebuild it as a benevolent dictatorship, one parliamentary procedure at a time. Before Brenda, the HOA had been typical suburban background noise: monthly meetings attended by maybe 6 people, discussions about snow removal contracts and playground maintenance, the kind of mild civic engagement that keeps neighborhoods functional without making anyone's life miserable. The meeting minutes from 2020 read like a book club secretary had been asked to document a casual chat between neighbors. Then, Brenda arrived. The January 2021 minutes marked the beginning of what I'd come to think of as the Wellington era. Suddenly, the meeting format changed. Robert's Rules of Order were implemented to ensure productive discourse. Committee structures were established to maximize community oversight. The Architectural Review Committee, which had previously consisted of whoever wants to take a look at your fence plans, became a formal 3-person board with written application processes, mandatory site inspections, and approval timelines that would have impressed a federal regulatory agency. By summer 2021, the minutes read like corporate board proceedings. Motions were made and seconded with military precision, committee reports were submitted in advance and distributed by email. Violation notices were standardized with tracking numbers and appeal procedures that referenced specific sections of a CC&R document that had grown from 12 pages to 47 pages during Brenda's first year in office. It was impressive, in the same way that watching someone build an elaborate mousetrap is impressive, right up until you realize you're the mouse. The phone call that morning had been my first direct contact with Brenda since our initial conversation about the door color, and it had been illuminating in all the wrong ways. She'd called at exactly 9 a.m., not 8:59, not 9:02, but 9 on the dot, as if she'd been sitting there watching the clock tick over before dialing my number. Mr. Davidson, this is Brenda Wellington from the Willowbrook Estates HOA. I trust you received our second notice regarding the violation at your property. I did, I said, settling back in my office chair. Although, I have to say, I'm still not entirely clear on what the actual problem is. There had been a pause. Not the kind of pause that suggests someone is thinking about their answer, but the kind that suggests someone is recalibrating their approach based on new information. The problem, Mr. Davidson, is that you made an exterior modification to your property without following the proper approval procedures. This isn't about personal preferences or aesthetic opinions. It's about maintaining the systems and standards that protect everyone's property values. I painted my door, I said. It's still a door. It still opens and closes. It still keeps the weather out of my house. Yes, but you painted it a color that hasn't been approved for use in our community. And more importantly, you did so without submitting an application to the Architectural Review Committee. Was I supposed to submit an application to paint my own door? Another pause. This one longer. Mr. Davidson, I'm beginning to suspect that you haven't actually read the CC&Rs that govern this community. All exterior modifications, regardless of scope, require pre-approval. That includes paint colors, landscaping changes, exterior fixtures, even mailbox replacements. This system exists to protect everyone's investment in this neighborhood. That's when she dropped the bomb about the emergency board meeting. The board will be meeting this Thursday evening at 7 p.m. to discuss your violation and determine the appropriate enforcement measures. You're welcome to attend and present your case, although I should warn you that the daily fines will continue to accrue until the violation is resolved. Daily fines. She'd said it so casually, like she was discussing the weather forecast. $50 a day, every day, secured by a lien against my property. In her world, this was just standard operating procedure. And what exactly would constitute resolving the violation, I asked. Repainting the door in an approved color and submitting the proper documentation to confirm compliance. The Architectural Review Committee can provide you with a list of approved contractors if you'd prefer to have the work done professionally. Approved contractors. Of course there were approved contractors. Or, she continued, you could submit a formal application requesting approval for the current color. Though I should mention that the committee has never approved red for door colors, and our current standards strongly emphasize earth tones that complement the natural environment. The natural environment. We lived in suburban Minnesota, where half the natural environment turned bright red every October. That conversation had been 3 days ago, 3 days during which I'd done what any self-respecting lawyer does when faced with an obviously corrupt system. I'd started building a case. The first thing I'd learned was that Brenda's emergency board meeting wasn't technically legal under Minnesota HOA statutes. Emergency meetings required either a genuine emergency, defined as immediate threats to health, safety, or property, or 72 hours advance notice to all homeowners. A door color that had been the same for 2 weeks didn't qualify for an emergency by any reasonable definition. The second thing I'd learned was that the daily fine structure was potentially problematic under state law. Minnesota requires that HOA fines be reasonable and proportionate to the violation, and $50 a day for a paint color was arguably neither. But the third thing I learned was the most interesting. Brenda's system was working exactly as designed. In the 3 years since she had taken over, violation notices had increased by 340%. Fine collections had jumped from an average of $1,200 per year to over $15,000. And property turnover had accelerated dramatically, with houses selling on average every 18 months instead of the previous 7-year average. People were being fined into compliance or fined out of the neighborhood entirely. And Brenda was documenting every step with the kind of meticulous record-keeping that would have made an IRS auditor weep with joy. Thursday evening arrived with the kind of October chill that makes you grateful for warm houses and solid doors, even red ones. The community center meeting room smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and disappointment.
with folding chairs arranged in precise rows facing a folding table where Brenda sat with two other board members I didn't recognize. She looked exactly like her voice sounded, crisp, professional, completely in control. Her hair was styled in the kind of bob that suggested she got it touched up every 6 weeks, whether it needed it or not, and her outfit was business casual in the most aggressive way possible. She had a leather portfolio in front of her, a digital voice recorder positioned just so, and a small stack of papers that I assumed contained my fate. "Mr. Davidson," she said as I walked in, "thank you for joining us this evening. Please take a seat wherever you're comfortable." There were 12 empty chairs, all facing the board table like defendants in a courtroom. I chose the one in the front row, directly across from Brenda, close enough to make the power dynamic obvious to everyone in the room. "Now then," she began, consulting her papers with the same attention she might give to a quarterly earnings report, "we're here to discuss the ongoing violation at 1455 Oak Street. Mr. Davidson, you've had 3 weeks to remedy."
Mr. Davidson, if you continue to disrupt the established order of this community, you may find that Willowbrook Estates simply isn't the right fit for your lifestyle. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, delivered with the kind of practiced menace that only comes from years of making people disappear from neighborhoods without technically breaking any laws. Brenda had just played her nuclear card, the polite suburban suggestion that maybe I should consider living somewhere else, delivered with a smile that could freeze antifreeze. But what she didn't realize, as she sat there in her perfectly coordinated beige blazer, shuffling through her manila folders full of manufactured violations, was that I'd spent the last 3 months building a case that would turn her own bureaucratic weapons against her. You see, Brenda Wellington had made the classic mistake of every petty tyrant throughout history. She'd gotten so drunk on her own cower that she'd forgotten to cover her tracks, and the paper trail she'd left behind was about to become her obituary. 3 months. That's how long it had taken for Brenda to transform a simple door color dispute into what felt like suburban warfare, conducted through certified mail and parking violations. 3 months during which my dining room had been converted into something that looked like a cross between a law office and a conspiracy theorist's fever dream, with documents covering every surface and color-coded filing systems that would have impressed the FBI. The emergency board meeting had just been the beginning. After I'd challenged the legality of their hastily called session, pointing out that Minnesota Statute 317A443 requires 72 hours notice for special meetings, unless there's an actual emergency. Brenda had pivoted with the kind of bureaucratic agility that comes from years of corporate compliance training. She'd adjourned the meeting, sent out proper notice, and reconvened exactly 73 hours later with an agenda that made the original emergency seem quaint by comparison. But that week between meetings had given me something invaluable. Time to dig deeper into the financial records that every HOA in Minnesota is required to make available to homeowners upon request. And what I'd found in those records was more interesting than any door color violation could ever be. The Willowbrook Estates HOA had annual dues of $240 per household, collected from 87 homes in the subdivision. Simple math put their annual budget at roughly $20,880, which should have been more than enough to cover snow removal, common area maintenance, and the kind of basic administrative costs that keep a small HOA functional. But according to the financial statements I'd requested, their actual annual expenses had ballooned to over $45,000, with the difference made up through what the treasurer's report euphemistically called compliance revenue. Compliance revenue. That's HOA speak for fines collected from homeowners who violated the increasingly elaborate rules that Brenda had implemented since taking office. The pattern became clear once I started cross-referencing the violation records with the financial statements. In 2020, before Brenda's ascension to president, the HOA had collected $1,247 in fines for the entire year.
Most of those were late fees for overdue annual dues, the kind of mundane administrative penalties that every organization deals with. But look at 2021, Brenda's first full year in power. $8,734 in compliance revenue. 2022 had jumped to $14,891, and the partial records for 2023 suggested they were on track to exceed $18,000 in fine collections. You want to know what's truly remarkable about that progression? It wasn't just the amount of money. It was the systematic way Brenda had engineered a self-sustaining violation economy. She'd identified the most common homeowner behaviors, the ones that people do automatically without thinking, and turned them into revenue streams. Trash cans left visible from the street after pickup day, $50 fine. Hargan hoses not properly stored, $25 fine. Holiday decorations left up past the designated removal date, $75 fine. And my personal favorite, discovered buried in the 2022 violation log, was unauthorized outdoor furniture placement, which apparently included leaving a lawn chair on your own front porch without submitting an Architectural Review Committee furniture placement application. But the real genius was in the appeal process. Brenda had created a system that was technically fair. Every fine could be appealed, every violation could be contested, but practically impossible for most people to navigate. Appeals had to be submitted in writing within 14 days, using forms that were only available by special request from the HOA office. The forms required detailed documentation, including photographs, witness statements, and references to specific sections of the CC&Rs that supported your position. Appeals were reviewed by the same board that had issued the original violation, and appeals hearings were scheduled during weekday business hours with exactly 48 hours notice. Most people just paid the fine. It was easier, cheaper in terms of time and stress, and that's exactly what Brenda was counting on. But she'd made one crucial miscalculation. She'd assumed that everyone in Willowbrook Estates was either too busy, too intimidated, or too ignorant to fight back effectively. She hadn't counted on dealing with someone who found bureaucratic combat genuinely entertaining. The second board meeting had been everything the first one should have been, properly noticed, fully documented, and conducted with all the parliamentary precision that Brenda could muster. She'd arrived with a briefcase full of evidence against me, including photographs of my door taken from multiple angles, printed copies of the relevant CC&R sections, and a timeline documenting my pattern of non-compliance. "Mr. Davidson," she'd begun, after calling the meeting to order with the kind of ceremonial gravity usually reserved for federal court proceedings, "you've now had 45 days to remedy the violation at your property. During this time, you've accumulated $2,250 in daily fines, plus administrative fees, for a total outstanding balance of $2,847. The board is prepared to work with you on a payment plan if you're ready to address the situation cooperatively." Payment plan. As if I was some financially distressed homeowner who couldn't afford to repaint a door. "Before we discuss payment," I'd said, opening my own briefcase, "I'd like to address a few questions about the HOA's authority to levy these particular fines." I'd seen Brenda's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. This wasn't going according to her script. "Mr. Davidson, the board's authority is clearly established in the CC&Rs that every homeowner agreed to when they purchased their property. These aren't arbitrary rules. They're legal obligations that protect everyone's property values." "I understand that," I'd said, pulling out the first document in my stack. "But I'm curious about the financial relationship between violation enforcement and the HOA's operating budget. According to the 2022 financial statements, compliance revenue represented 33% of the association's total income. That's a significant dependency on violation fines for basic operations." The room got very quiet. The other two board members, Janet Morrison from Elm Street and Bob Chen from Pine Avenue, exchanged glances that suggested this wasn't territory they'd expected to navigate. "What exactly are you implying?" Brenda had asked, her professional composure showing its first hairline crack. "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating a fact. This HOA has become financially dependent on collecting fines from homeowners. And when an organization's budget depends on finding violations, there's a natural incentive to find more violations." That's when Brenda made her first serious tactical error. She got defensive. "Mr. Davidson, I resent the implication that this board manufactures violations for financial gain. Every citation we issue is based on legitimate breaches of community standards that are clearly defined in our governing documents." "Really?" I said, pulling out the next document. "Because I've been reviewing those governing documents, and I've found some interesting discrepancies between the CC&Rs that were filed with the county in 2018 and the versions that are currently posted on the community website." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes avalanches. Bob Chen cleared his throat nervously. Janet Morrison suddenly found her notepad fascinating, and Brenda Wellington realized, probably for the first time in 3 years, that she was sitting across from someone who had actually read the fine print. The county clerk's office has the original CC&Rs on file, filed in 2018 when the subdivision was established. Those documents contain a fairly standard set of architectural guidelines, basic stuff about maintaining properties, keeping common areas clean, that sort of thing. But the CC&Rs that are currently being enforced contain dozens of
Going once, going twice, sold to Heritage Red Properties, LLC, for $127,000. The gavel came down with the satisfying thud of karma finally catching up to bureaucratic overreach, and I watched Brenda Wellington's face drain of color as she realized exactly which LLC had just purchased her best friend's foreclosed colonial for 40% below market value. 6 months of meticulous planning had led to this moment. Standing on courthouse steps on a crisp Tuesday morning, watching the woman who'd tried to destroy my life over a door color discover that her reign of suburban terror had created the very weapon I was using to dismantle her kingdom. You see, while Brenda had been busy playing dictator with violation notices and emergency meetings, I'd been playing chess with property law and municipal ordinances. And the beautiful irony was that every foreclosure hammer that fell was powered by the same aggressive enforcement system she'd built to keep people like me in line. She'd turned our neighborhood into a financial battlefield, and now she was about to learn what happens when you pick a fight with someone who actually knows how to win a war. The discovery had started, like most revelations do, with a single loose thread that I couldn't resist pulling. 3 weeks after that disastrous board meeting where I'd exposed the unauthorized CC&R modifications, I'd been reviewing the county property records for something completely unrelated when I'd noticed an unusual pattern in the Willowbrook Estates transaction history. In the 18 months before Brenda became HOA president, exactly 3 houses in our subdivision had changed hands. Normal turnover for a mature neighborhood with stable property values and residents who'd put down roots. But in the 36 months since her election, 17 properties had been sold. 17 out of 87 total homes, nearly 20% turnover in a neighborhood that had previously been as stable as a cemetery. More interesting than the volume was the pricing pattern. These weren't normal market sales where neighbors cash out their equity and move somewhere warmer. These were distress sales, properties selling for 10 to 40% below assessed value, often to cash buyers, frequently through estate sales or foreclosure proceedings.
I'd started making calls, not official legal inquiries, nothing that would show up in public records or tip off anyone who might be paying attention. Just casual conversations with neighbors, the kind of suburban intelligence gathering that happens over backyard fences and during weekend lawn mowing sessions. The Hendersons at 1423 Oak Street had been the first to go. Lovely, retired couple who'd lived there for 15 years until Brenda discovered that their backyard garden shed was 3 inches too close to the property line, according to the updated setback requirements she had implemented in year 2 of her presidency. The violations had started small. $25 fines for the shed placement, $50 for having their trash cans visible from the street on non-collection days, but they'd escalated quickly when the Hendersons had pushed back, eventually reaching the point where they were accumulating $200 a week in various compliance fees. We couldn't fight it anymore, Mrs. Henderson had told me when I'd run into her at the grocery store 6 months after they'd moved out. Between the legal fees and the fines, we were spending more on HOA disputes than we were on our mortgage. At our age, we didn't have the energy for that kind of stress. The Patels at 1456 Maple Lane had been next. Young, professional couple who'd made the mistake of installing a decorative mailbox without submitting the proper architectural review application. Brenda had discovered the violation during one of her routine neighborhood inspections, a practice she'd instituted in year 2 that involved walking the subdivision with a clipboard and a measuring tape, documenting any deviations from her increasingly elaborate standards. The mailbox violation had triggered a cascade of additional scrutiny that revealed 13 other minor infractions, from hedge height violations to unauthorized outdoor lighting. By the time the Patels had accumulated enough fines to warrant a property lien, they'd already decided it was cheaper to sell the house and start over somewhere else. The pattern was consistent across all 17 properties. Minor violations that escalated into major financial burdens, followed by distressed sales to cash buyers who could close quickly and weren't deterred by the HOA drama that came with the property. But here's the thing that had caught my attention. Most of those cash buyers were LLCs with vague names and post office box addresses, property management companies and investment groups that specialized in purchasing distressed residential properties, fixing them up just enough to pass inspection, and flipping them to rental tenants or new homeowners who didn't know the neighborhood's history. That's when I'd realized what Brenda Wellington had inadvertently created, the perfect conditions for a hostile real estate takeover. She'd been so focused on forcing compliance with her elaborate rule system that she'd driven down property values and created a fire sale market in one of the most desirable subdivisions in the county. And that's when I decided to become a cash buyer myself. Setting up Heritage Red Properties, LLC, took exactly 47 minutes and cost me $235 in filing fees with the Minnesota Secretary of State. The name was my little private joke, a reference to the door color that started this whole conflict, but legally it was as legitimate as any other property investment company. I'd registered the business address at a UPS store mailbox 3 towns over, opened a dedicated business banking account, and established a credit line that would allow me to move quickly when the right opportunities presented themselves. The first opportunity came sooner than I had expected. The Kowalskis at 1401 Elm Street had been fighting a protracted battle over their front yard landscaping, which apparently violated the native plant requirements that Brenda had added to the CC&Rs during her second year. The violations had started small, $25 fines for the shed placement, $50 for having their trash cans visible from the street on non-collection days, but they'd escalated quickly when the Hendersons had pushed back, eventually reaching the point where they were accumulating $200 a week in various compliance fees. We couldn't fight it anymore, Mrs. Henderson had told me when I'd run into her at the grocery store 6 months after they'd moved out. Between the legal fees and the fines, we were spending more on HOA disputes than we were on our mortgage. At our age, we didn't have the energy for that kind of stress. The Patels at 1456 Maple Lane had been next. Young, professional couple who'd made the mistake of installing a decorative mailbox without submitting the proper architectural review application. Brenda had discovered the violation during one of her routine neighborhood inspections, a practice she'd instituted in year 2 that involved walking the subdivision with a clipboard and a measuring tape, documenting any deviations from her increasingly elaborate standards. The mailbox violation had triggered a cascade of additional scrutiny that revealed 13 other minor infractions, from hedge height violations to unauthorized outdoor lighting. By the time the Patels had accumulated enough fines to warrant a property lien, they'd already decided it was cheaper to sell the house and start over somewhere else. The pattern was consistent across all 17 properties. Minor violations that escalated into major financial burdens, followed by distress sales to cash buyers who could close quickly and weren't deterred by the HOA drama that came with the property. But here's the thing that had caught my attention. Most of those cash buyers were LLCs with vague names and post office box addresses, property management companies and investment groups that specialized in purchasing distressed residential properties, fixing them up just enough to pass inspection, and flipping them to rental tenants or new homeowners who didn't know the neighborhood's history. That's when I'd realized what Brenda Wellington had inadvertently created, the perfect conditions for a hostile real estate takeover. She'd been so focused on forcing compliance with her elaborate rule system that she'd driven down property values and created a fire sale market in one of the most desirable subdivisions in the county. And that's when I decided to become a cash buyer myself. Setting up Heritage Red Properties, LLC, took exactly 47 minutes and cost me $235 in filing fees with the Minnesota Secretary of State. The name was my little private joke, a reference to the door color that started this whole conflict. But legally, it was as legitimate as any other property investment company. I'd registered the business address at a UPS store mailbox 3 towns over, opened a dedicated business banking account, and established a credit line that would allow me to move quickly when the right opportunities presented themselves. The first opportunity came sooner than I had expected. The Kowalskis at 1401 Elm Street had been fighting a protracted battle over their front yard landscaping, which apparently violated the native plant requirements that Brenda had added to the CC&Rs during her second year. The violations had started small: $25 fines for the shed placement, $50 for having their trash cans visible from the street on. Your monthly rent of $2,847 is due on the 1st of each month, payable to Heritage Red Properties, LLC. The certified letter slid under Brenda Wellington's door at exactly 8 a.m. with the whisper-quiet satisfaction of perfectly executed revenge, carrying the most beautiful sentence I'd ever composed in 15 years of legal writing. Through her front window, I could see her bathrobe-clad figure freeze in her hallway as she processed what she was reading. The same woman who'd spent 18 months trying to fine me into submission was now my tenant, paying market-rate rent to live in what used to be her own house. The irony was so perfect, it almost felt scripted. Brenda had been so obsessed with controlling other people's property values that she'd completely lost track of her own financial situation, and now the foreclosure system she'd fed with her victims had finally consumed its creator. You want to know what real power looks like? It's not writing violation notices or holding emergency board meetings. Real power is holding someone's mortgage while they're still trying to figure out how their kingdom crumbled around them. The transformation of Brenda Wellington from HOA dictator to my most profitable tenant had taken exactly 14 months and required more patience than I'd thought myself capable of. But watching her read that lease agreement through her front window made every late night of property research and every courthouse appearance worth the effort. The foreclosure had been inevitable from the moment she'd escalated our door color dispute into a full-scale legal battle. What Brenda hadn't realized, what she couldn't have realized because she'd been too intoxicated by her own authority to think strategically, was that fighting me wasn't just costing her time and credibility, it was costing her money, serious money, the kind of money that even a well-paid corporate compliance officer couldn't sustain indefinitely. See, the beautiful thing about being a real estate attorney is that you learn to recognize the warning signs of financial distress long before they become obvious to civilians. And Brenda had been displaying those warning signs for months without realizing it. It started with small changes in her routine. The lawn service that had maintained her property's magazine-perfect appearance disappeared sometime in month 8 of our conflict. Her weekly manicures, I'd noticed them during our various confrontations, became bi-weekly, then monthly. The brand-new Lexus that had been her pride and joy was traded in for a 3-year-old Toyota sometime around month 10. But the real tell was in the public records. Brenda had taken out a home equity line of credit in month 6, ostensibly for home improvements according to the loan documentation. But there had been no home improvements. Instead, there had been legal fees. Thousands of dollars in legal fees for the attorneys she'd hired to pursue her HOA enforcement actions against me and the dozen other homeowners who'd started pushing back against her increasingly aggressive violation policies. By month 12, she'd maxed out the equity line. By month 14, she'd missed her first mortgage payment. And by month 16, the foreclosure notice had been posted on her door with the same bureaucratic efficiency she'd once used to terrorize her neighbors. I'd been tracking the foreclosure proceedings through the county clerk's system, waiting for the right moment to make my move. The auction date had been set for a Tuesday morning in November, with bidding starting at 60% of the assessed value due to the accumulated liens and legal complications surrounding the property. The morning of the sale, I'd arrived early and positioned myself where I could watch the other potential bidders. There weren't many. Foreclosure auctions in suburban subdivisions don't typically attract the kind of crowd you see for commercial properties or urban real estate. Just a handful of investment companies and individual speculators looking for distressed properties they could flip quickly. What I hadn't expected was for Brenda to show up and watch her own house get auctioned off. But there she was, standing at the back of the crowd with the kind of hollow expression you see on people who are witnessing the destruction of everything they've built. The auction had been surprisingly competitive. 2 other investors had clearly done their homework and recognized that Brenda's property was fundamentally sound, despite the legal complications. But I'd had advantages they didn't. I knew the neighborhood intimately. I understood exactly why the property was being foreclosed, and I had the financial resources to bid aggressively without worrying about immediate cash flow. When the gavel had finally come down at $287,000, about 40% below market value, I'd seen Brenda's shoulders slump in defeat. She'd walked away before the paperwork was completed, probably unable to watch the final details of her financial ruin being documented by strangers. But the real masterpiece had come 3 weeks later when I'd approached her about staying in the house as a tenant. The conversation had taken place on her front porch, my front porch technically, though she didn't know that yet. I'd arrived on a Saturday morning with a folder of documents and what I hoped looked like a reasonable expression. "Brenda," I said when she'd answered the door, "I think we need to talk." She looked older than I remembered, worn down by months of legal battles and financial stress. The perfectly coordinated outfits had been replaced by casual clothes that looked like they'd been chosen for comfort rather than presentation. "What do you want, Jake?" she asked me, and for the first time since I'd known her, she'd sounded genuinely tired rather than combative. "I want to make you an offer," I said, opening the folder. "I know you're probably making arrangements to move out, looking for a new place, dealing with all the complications that come with, well, with your current situation." "Just say it," she said. "You know I lost the house. Everyone in the neighborhood knows it." I also know that moving is expensive and stressful, especially when you're dealing with credit issues and time constraints. So I'm prepared to offer you a lease agreement that would allow you to stay here, in the house that you've lived in for 8 years, while you get your financial situation sorted out." The expression on her face was worth every penny I'd spent acquiring her property. Confusion, hope, suspicion, and something that might have been gratitude cycled through in rapid succession. "You're offering to rent me my own house?" she asked. "I'm offering you to rent you a house that I own," I corrected gently. "The same house you've been living in, but under a standard residential lease agreement." She was quiet for a long moment, probably trying to process the surreal nature of what was happening. "What are the terms?" she finally asked. I handed her the lease agreement I'd prepared. Market rate rent, which comes to $2,847 per month. Standard lease terms, 1-year initial commitment, security deposit equal to first month's rent, normal provisions about maintenance and property care. She scanned the document, and I watched her face change as she processed the financial reality of what I was offering. "I can't afford that," she said quietly. "Actually," I said, pulling out another document, "I think you can. According to the financial disclosure forms you filed in your legal proceedings against me, your monthly income, after taxes, is approximately $4,200. Rent of $2,847 puts your housing costs at about 68% of income, which is high, but not unprecedented for someone rebuilding their credit." The look she gave me then was a mixture of admiration and horror. Admiration for the thoroughness of my research, horror at the realization that I knew exactly how trapped she was. "You've been planning this," she said. It wasn't a question. "I've been responding to circumstances as they've developed. But yes, I've been thorough." That had been 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks during which Brenda Wellington had signed a lease agreement, paid a security deposit, and officially become my tenant. 6 weeks during which the most controlling person I'd ever met had been forced to ask permission to make minor changes to the property she'd once ruled like her personal kingdom. But the real satisfaction hadn't come from the power reversal, though that was certainly enjoyable. The real satisfaction had come from the rental income. At $2,847 per month, Brenda's lease alone covered most of the mortgage payments on 3 of my other properties. Combined with the rent from my other tenants, most of whom were lovely people who'd moved into the neighborhood after I acquired their houses, my monthly rental income from Willowbrook Estates was approaching $18,000. $18,000 a month, generated by the same foreclosure crisis that Brenda's aggressive HOA enforcement had created. It was the kind of poetic justice that made you believe the universe has a sense of humor after all. Standing in my driveway that morning, watching Brenda read her first official rent notice through the window of what used to be her house, I found myself wondering what would happen next. She was trapped now. Her credit was destroyed, her savings were gone, and she couldn't afford to move somewhere else. But Brenda Wellington wasn't the type of person who accepted defeat gracefully. Which raised the question, what was a former HOA dictator going to do when she realized that her new landlord was the same person she'd spent 2 years trying to destroy?
I hereby call this final meeting of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association to order and move to dissolve this organization effective immediately. The gavel came down with the satisfying finality of a judge's sentence, echoing through the community center conference room where Brenda Wellington had once held court like a suburban dictator with a laminated rulebook and dreams of absolute power. But tonight, I was the one sitting at the head of that folding table, reading dissolution paperwork to an audience of exactly 3 people, all of whom happened to be my tenants now. The irony was so perfect, it felt orchestrated by the universe itself. The same room where Brenda had tried to fine me into submission
had become the venue for dismantling her entire bureaucratic empire, one parliamentary procedure at a time. You see, when you own 63% of the properties in an HOA subdivision, you don't just get to vote on the rules, you get to decide whether there should be rules at all. And after 2 years of living under Brenda's reign of terror, I decided that Willowbrook Estates would be much better off without an HOA entirely. 6 months had passed since that morning when I'd slipped the rent notice under Brenda's door. 6 months during which the neighborhood had transformed in ways that went beyond simple property ownership changes. Walking through Willowbrook Estates now felt like visiting a completely different subdivision, one where people actually seemed to enjoy living in their own homes. The change had started gradually, almost imperceptibly. New tenants had moved into the properties I'd acquired, and unlike the stressed, intimidated homeowners who'd fled Brenda's violation campaigns, these people had arrived with the confidence that comes from knowing their landlord isn't going to fine them for leaving their trash cans visible from the street. The Newhin family had painted their shutters a cheerful blue that complemented their colonial's brick facade. The Johnsons had installed a decorative mailbox shaped like their golden retriever. Mrs. Peterson, a retired art teacher, had planted a wildflower garden that attracted butterflies and horrified Brenda in equal measure. Each small act of self-expression had been like a crack in the foundation of Brenda's authority. She'd tried to issue violation notices, of course. Old habits die hard, especially when they're backed by years of successful intimidation. But the violations had gone unanswered because most of the violators were my tenants, and I'd made it very clear in their lease agreements that they were free to decorate and maintain their properties according to their own tastes within reasonable limits. The breaking point had come 3 months ago, during what would turn out to be the last traditional HOA meeting Brenda would ever conduct. She'd called the meeting to address what her agenda euphemistically described as concerning trends in community standards. But what everyone in the room knew was her desperate attempt to reassert control over a neighborhood that was rapidly slipping away from her. I'd arrived early that night, as had become my custom, and taken a seat in the front row where I could watch Brenda's increasingly frantic attempts to maintain order. She'd looked smaller somehow, diminished by months of financial stress and the dawning realization that her authority was evaporating with each property I acquired. The first item on tonight's agenda, she'd begun, consulting her meticulously organized notes, is the alarming increase in unauthorized exterior modifications across multiple properties in our community. She'd pulled out a stack of photographs, evidence of her neighbor's crimes against suburban conformity: a red mailbox, blue shutters, a garden gnome, wind chimes. Each image had been printed on high-quality paper and labeled with the property address and violation code, the kind of documentation that would have impressed a federal prosecutor. These violations represent a fundamental breakdown in community standards, she'd continued, her voice taking on the lecturing tone I'd come to know so well. When homeowners ignore our established guidelines, it affects everyone's property values and undermines the aesthetic harmony that makes Willowbrook Estates a desirable place to live. That's when I raised my hand. "Yes, Mr. Davidson," she'd said, probably hoping I was going to ask a procedural question she could answer with another citation from her beloved CC&Rs. "I'm curious about something," I'd said, standing up and pulling out my own folder. "According to the most recent property records, I currently own 17 of the 27 properties that have outstanding violations. Since I'm both the property owner and the landlord for most of these alleged violations, I'm wondering what authority this board has to fine me for modifications I've specifically authorized on my own properties." The silence that followed was the kind you hear right before buildings collapse. Bob Chen and Janet Morrison, the two remaining board members who hadn't been driven out by Brenda's increasingly authoritarian management style, had exchanged glances that suggested they were just now grasping the full implications of my property acquisition strategy. "The CC&Rs apply to all properties in the subdivision," Brenda had said, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. Actually, I'd said, opening my folder, I've been reviewing the legal structure of this HOA, and I've found some interesting discrepancies. For example, did you know that under Minnesota Statute 515B.3-102, any homeowners association that loses more than 60% of its member properties to a single owner is automatically subject to dissolution proceedings? I'd watched the color drain from Brenda's face as she'd processed what I was telling her. As of yesterday's closing on the Morrison property, I'd nodded apologetically to Janet. Heritage Red Properties owns 55 of the 87 homes in this subdivision. That's 63%, which means this HOA no longer meets the minimum requirements for continued operation under state law. The room had gone completely quiet. Even the ancient fluorescent lights had seemed to stop humming. "What are you saying?" Brenda had asked, though she could tell she already knew. "I'm saying that this homeowners association is hereby dissolved by operation of law," I'd said, pulling out the paperwork I'd prepared for this exact moment. "I've already filed the necessary documents with the county clerk and the state attorney general's office. Effective immediately, there are no more CCNRs, no more architectural review committees, no more violation notices, and no more HOA meetings." The devastation on Brenda's face was complete. She'd built her entire identity around controlling this neighborhood, and I'd just eliminated the legal framework that had given her that power. "You can't just dissolve an HOA," she'd protested weakly. "Actually, I can," I'd said, "and I just did." That had been 3 months ago. 3 months during which Willowbrook Estates had transformed from a tightly controlled suburban prison into something that actually resembled a community. The wildflower gardens had spread, children had started playing in front yards instead of hiding in backyards, people had begun talking to each other across property lines instead of reporting each other for violation infractions. And Brenda had finally moved out. I'd watched the moving truck pull away from 1247 Maple Lane on a crisp Saturday morning, carrying the last remnants of her reign of terror to whatever new neighborhood she'd found to call home. She'd left without saying goodbye, though she'd made sure to document every minor flaw in the property's condition when she'd returned her keys. Old habits die hard, I suppose. The house had rented within a week to the Patel family, young professionals with 2 kids and a golden retriever who seemed delighted to discover that their new landlord's only rule was, "Be a good neighbor." Their rent check, like all the others, had arrived promptly on the 1st of the month, made out to Heritage Red Properties, and carrying the subtle reminder that sometimes the best revenge is simply outlasting your enemies. Standing in my doorway that morning, coffee in hand, I surveyed what had once been Brenda Wellington's kingdom and was now simply a neighborhood where people lived their lives without fear of bureaucratic retaliation. The Heritage Red door that had started this whole conflict still gleamed in the morning sun, no longer a violation of community standards, but simply a door that kept the weather out and welcomed friends in. The final irony hadn't been lost on me. In her obsession with controlling property values through aggressive enforcement, she'd actually driven down prices and created the very market conditions that had allowed me to acquire most of the neighborhood at below-market rates. Now, 2 years later, those same properties are worth more than they'd ever been, generating rental income that had turned a simple door color dispute into the foundation of a very profitable real estate portfolio. Sometimes, when I'm feeling philosophical, I wonder what would have happened if Brenda had simply minded her own business that first day I painted my door. Would she still be living in her house, still be collecting violation fines, still be the undisputed queen of Willowbrook Estates? Probably. But then I remember the look on Mrs. Henderson's face when she told me about being fined into bankruptcy for a garden shed. And I think about the Patel family's kids playing in their front yard without fear of some bureaucrat with a measuring tape. And I realize that some people's downfall is everyone else's liberation. The morning sun was warming the heritage red paint on my door, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the sound of children laughing. It was the sound of a neighborhood that had finally remembered how to be a home. And every month